Hello, good afternoon. I'm Brenda Croeso. Thank you for joining us for our latest Cydrannu webinar as part of the Cydrannu Knowledge Sharing series. I'm Corey Hughes. I'm part of the delivery team for Cyd. So we have a very exciting session coming up this afternoon, but before we kick off, just to remind everybody that we are recording today's session. This is so that we can share it on our website and allow as many people as possible to access the content. So the way that this afternoon's session will run is that firstly, we will hear from our guest speaker, and then we will open up for discussion and questions. So we have around an hour for the session today, so there's lots of time to dig into this topic. Please feel free as we go through the talk to add any questions you have to the Q&A section that is in the functionality of Zoom, or you can add your comments and thoughts to the chat at any time. We'll pick them up from there. If you have any technical issues, they sometimes happen on these platforms, and Zoom has just done a timely update for everyone attending, then my colleague Sumi, who is behind the red dragon, is supporting us today, and she will do her best to help you. You can message Sumi directly in the chat, and she will also keep an eye on the Q&A and chat functions. So before I introduce this afternoon's guest speaker, I'd like to ask my colleague Em just to say a few words about the Welsh language support available today. So over to you, Em.
Helo, croeso, enw i Emma. Dwi'n meddwl os ydych chi'n meddwl bod y cwestiwn yna tynnu yn y chat box neu trwy llaw fyny a siarad. Diolch.
Diolch, Em. So for today's session, we are joined by Alice Horn from the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. And Alice is going to share their reflections on an event that they held recently in collaboration with Chwmpas. We were also going to be joined by Jonathan Tench. Unfortunately, he's not feeling so great today, so Alice will be sharing some of his reflections too as part of the session. The event itself explored how to improve the economic, social, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales through procurement, which is obviously very close to our hearts here in Cyd also. And this included the supply side role of the private and social sectors. As I said, there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussion, so please do drop them into the Q&A as we go. But without further ado, let's get started. I will hand you over to Alice. Croeso, Alice.
Diolch yn fawr. Thank you for the introduction. I am just going to wait for you to stop sharing your screen and then I can share mine. I've prepared some slides for today. So apologies, I'll just be 1 minute. There we go. May I just ask when you're able to see the screen, if you're able to give me like a thumbs up or an indication that you can see my slides. Fab, thank you. So I'm just going to wait for it to go into slideshow mode. There's always the technical lag, isn't there, with these things? You did a very smooth introduction, Corey, so apologies. Okay, so I think we're just getting there. So I'll start talking while we wait for this to load. Oh, here we go. So yeah, as Corey introduced, I'm here today to share some reflections and some kind of the themes that came up from the discussions of a recent event that I held at Swansea Business School on the 27th of September. So this was in collaboration with Chwmpas, and there was involvement from Welsh Government as well. The theme of this session was around procuring for well-being, looking at what is possible to consider when the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is at the core of procurement decision-making. This event actually came out of kind of requests and demand following on from a previous event that I had held in Wrexham back in November. November, where we really focused on what it is procurement could deliver when the Act is at the heart. And in this discussion, we focused more on kind of how we can do it and provided space to have discussions around what's happening at the moment in this space. So the aims for this Procuring of Wellbeing session were to provide support to organisations to procure in a way that contributes towards economic, social, environmental and cultural wellbeing. We wanted to have an opportunity to showcase good practice, look at examples that have already delivered wellbeing impacts, and discuss what outcomes are possible and how we can deliver them through applying the 5 ways of working. And those are collaboration, involvement, integration, prevention and long-term. And lastly, considering how we can maximise a joined-up approach to procurement, considering the local market. I'm aware within those aims, I've used a lot of buzzwords, and we're going to break those down in the next slides. So to start, I wanted to share this map with you because the training that we delivered in this session around procuring for wellbeing is part of a broader learning and development offer that the Future Generations Commissioner Office is providing. It's there to provide advice and support to public bodies, to PSBs and wider organisations. And we're really working to help you act in a way that can help public bodies and the people they serve. I think it's particularly timely at the moment, considering the kind of crisis mode that a lot of public bodies are in with working within reduced budgets. So I can share, if you're from an organisation within this map or within the region, I'm more than happy to pass on the contact details for my colleagues. And these are the kind of key points of contact, the people that hold relationships with these public bodies, PSBs and regions. Also a team of people at the Commissioner's Office that lead in different specialisms as well. It's not just us 4. At the start of our session around procuring for wellbeing, I asked those who attended to join with kind of challenges to introduce themselves, but to share those kind of challenges, current projects, work problems or scenarios that they want to apply the Act to. I wanted to share some of them today because I'm sure they'll be common across organisations. So looking at, for example, the complexities of trade-offs, how you can choose one aspect of the Act over another, equally how you balance the broader priorities, be them policy priorities or within an organisation. There was a great discussion around individual wellbeing, and that when we're working within these spaces, it's important to consider our own wellbeing as well as the wellbeing of our organisations. How do we make it clear that we are contributing to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and why is that important? Do we need to be explicit with these measures? Sometimes procurement is very visible with its price tag, and given the kind of current situation that public bodies are in now, that financial stability guides decisions, and how do we navigate that theme? Also looking at it being more challenging, capturing the kind of well-being around smaller contracts as well, and people brought to the group that sometimes it's easier when there's a higher spend to deliver around well-being, but what do we do when we're working with smaller organisations or smaller communities and smaller projects? And one of the other scenarios was, how can we work in a way where Wales is kind of leading the way in this space? How can we share lessons that we're doing with other countries? I'm going to provide a brief overview of the kind of legislative architecture. This is the drier bit, I think, so please bear with me. And normally it would be a few slides, but because of time, I've put it all on this one nice slide. So the session provided an introduction and a refresher on the Act in detail. And actually, one of the learning and development sessions that we're running at the moment are refreshers on the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. These are kind of for people that are new and aren't familiar with this legislation, or for people that just want a bit more knowledge. So if this is something that is of interest and you would be kind of interested in hearing more about, I can share links as well. But today I just wanted to flag that we have developed 7 national wellbeing goals. This is kind of the shared vision that we want to be working towards. It was actually developed, the wellbeing goals, by taking the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and putting them in a Welsh context, really demonstrating what we can do to enact change. They're sometimes described as the kind of what it is that we're trying to achieve. So we've got a prosperous, resilient, healthier, more equal, a Wales of cohesive communities, and a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language. The Act also introduces 5 ways of working, sometimes described as the how. So we want to be working in collaboration, taking an integrated approach, involving other people rather, thinking about the long-term impact as well as prevention. One of the great things about the ways of working is you can start wherever you feel more confident. There's no right one to start with, and actually you might find if you start to work in collaboration, thinking about the long term might come naturally. So one way of working will lead into another. And so this process of applying the 5 ways of working towards this kind of shared vision, you end up kind of in this process of improving the economic, social, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales, which is kind of the foundations of the Sustainable Development Principle. What was great about the session is because we had speakers from Chwmpas and from Welsh Government, there was this kind of shared feeling that the economic, social, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales really needs to be at the heart of the decisions that we're making. Adam Cox, who spoke from Chwmpas, said that the Future Generations Act gives us ambition and the legal obligation to improve our economic, social, environmental and cultural well-being as a nation. Wales has everything to gain by taking the letter and the spirit of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act on board. Carl Thomas from Welsh Government came and talked about the current work to develop wellbeing impacts. And these wellbeing impacts are described as the positive contribution our commercial activity can have on the economic, social, environmental and cultural wellbeing of Wales in a way that accords with the Sustainable Development Principle as articulated in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So you can really see here that those 4 principles and those 4 dimensions of wellbeing are really at the heart of what we're working to deliver. And it sets a clear ambition that the Act should be at the core of procurement decision making. This slide also outlines kind of the Welsh context, understanding Wales, the national indicators and the milestones and the future trends report. I'm going to touch on those in a minute. I wanted to flag first the involvement way of working. This is an area that I get asked about a lot, that when we're looking at procurement, how do we involve people? When do we involve them? And who should be part of this conversation? In the session, we had a lot of time to discuss kind of common practices, good practices, and I wanted to share some examples of things that are happening in other sectors, in some of the public bodies around involvement. So the Bannau Brycheiniog National Park Authority set a long-term vision involving people in the making of this plan. It's a really good long-term plan to have a look at. Amgylcheddol Cymru has a case study on our website. We actually have a whole host of case studies that we're trying to improve and build on. But they've got a case study around how they work with involving younger people. There's an example around Minecrafting Your Museum that they won an award for. Denbighshire County Council have been doing work to involve volunteers and the community around their woodland. And then I also include this example from NRW, where they worked with Cycle UK and landowners and off-road cyclists to develop together a cycle route that goes through North Wales. And then there are some resources that we touched on as well. So there's one around a journey to involvement. This is on our website, looking at some of the steps you could start to take on your journey to involving people in your procurement decisions. And I also included the recently published and Fuse book there, because there are some examples of things other people are already doing on their journey to involving people. We also had a discussion around looking at what outcomes are possible. So a lot of these came from the first session that we ran in November. What is it that we could deliver when we put the Act at the heart of procurement decisions? Quite often, and the reason I flagged this slide is that procurement gets put under the Prosperous Wales Wellbeing Goal, whereas actually you can see here that it can contribute to all 7 of the wellbeing goals. And that's really important, that we're not just picking 1 or 2, but we're picking all of them. So you can see under a more equal Wales, we can deliver fair work. Around a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, we can look at ensuring our decisions reflect the diversity and culture in all our communities. And you can see how then, if we're involving people in the way that we approach our procurement decisions, that those people should be reflecting the diversity and culture of our communities. So it really is important to focus on how we're doing it with those ways of working to deliver some of these outcomes. Our analysis, the office's analysis of the objectives and steps that public bodies must set and take, all reasonable steps to meet in carrying out sustainable development, have really highlighted that there's an increased focus on procurement at a senior decision-making kind of strategic level. So the table on or the graph rather on the right indicates that the public body's objectives and steps around procurement have actually increased. The bullet points on the left are a flavour of some of those steps that are being taken. So we're seeing here that some councils are taking steps to review their approach to procurement in line with the Sustainable Development Principle, looking at improving analysis of expenditure and building local supply chains, looking at local procurement. So we're seeing themes and examples that procurement is at the kind of top of the table, that it is at this strategic space. But it's important then to look at, if we've got steps around this and we've got objectives around procurement, how do we measure them? How do we decide kind of what are good measures of success? And how do we make sure that the well-being objectives are in turn improving the economic, environmental, social and cultural well-being of Wales? And what the connections are between the two. I want to come back, I mentioned it briefly a minute ago, around the national indicators. So Welsh Government published national indicators that measure progress towards the wellbeing goals. What I think is interesting is that these measures can be quantitative and qualitative. We don't just need to rely on statistics, we can really use kind of storytelling and narratives to showcase progress as well. And not all of these indicators are going to be obviously really connected to the impacts that we can have in procurement, but there are already measures in place that can be a place to go to look at what it is as a country that we're working towards. So a few of these kind of indicators I wanted to flag are around the percentage of people who feel able to influence decisions affecting their local area, the status of biological diversity in Wales, as well as the percentage of journeys by walking, cycling or public transport. In addition to the wellbeing indicators, Welsh Government also publishes a future trends report. So this is there to help us understand the kind of what Wales in the future could look like, and it can help us respond accordingly. It includes resources and analysis to help us improve our ability to understand what might happen in the future. And that helps us apply that kind of long-term way of working. The majority of the session that we delivered focused around this activity. We used the Future Generations framework to help people apply some of the thinking around the Act to that problem or challenge that they came with. Just to highlight the kind of key principles of this tool, the Future Generations framework helps us to apply the different aspects of the Act to an ongoing project. It allows us to look at our wellbeing objectives, thinking about how the project that we're doing can contribute to our organisational objectives. It looks at the 5 ways of working and asks us questions about how they're being applied. And then the third area are these 7 wellbeing goals. So it really breaks down the different aspects of the Act and provides a selection of questions to look at how it is that we're contributing to the Act. The discussions were really interesting because we had a variety of organisations and job roles, and we had a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different challenges that people were bringing to the session. But I've kind of been able to theme these into kind of 3 areas. The first are the ones on the slide now around the ways of working. It was overwhelmingly clear that the ways of working were how people were going to create the change in their organisations. And there was kind of an agreement around the room that this is where we should start. So just as a reminder, the ways of working are collaboration, involvement, integration, long-term and prevention. And there were questions around, how do we meaningfully apply this? How do we take this knowledge and apply it? And how can it be done in a meaningful way rather than perhaps as a tick box exercise? There was a lot of kind of thoughtful discussion around that. It doesn't have to look exactly the same. It isn't about applying the same rules in the same way at the same time. And it might be that the Act looks different in different contexts. It might be that you can contribute to different organisational priorities and you might get different results. We reflected that at the moment, in the room, it didn't feel like there was a consistent mechanism to involve people. And by that, we talked about just having the space and the time to include stakeholders in a dialogue around sustainable development, around organisational priorities, around why it is that we want to be thinking long term and to deliver benefits within our communities, and how we could maybe go on and look at spaces for that, and involving people that are most affected by the decisions that we're making, and how important it is to consider that. Also looked at the challenges around the complex landscape that we all know we kind of exist and sit in, and that sometimes perhaps it's the policies and legislation that can make it confusing. There was a sense in the room that actually a lot of what we're talking about is just good procurement, but it gets misunderstood when we have all of these different policies that are not I can't even speak anymore, that are not integrated together. I'm going to just put that down to it being towards the end of the day. Integrate. Oh, I can't say it now. And then one of the other aspects that we reflected on is that even with a low spend, when you add that up, it does become a huge amount of money. So it's really important to involve people, to broaden who's trained around a procurement, around those 4 dimensions of well-being, so that we're all working on the same page, that we are all bought into this shared vision, and that we shouldn't overlook a smaller spend to not being able to contribute to our well-being. The second theme was around measurement, around what should we be measuring and reporting on, what do we measure at the moment and where are the gaps, but again that focus on the power of smaller spend. So one of the areas we discussed was around the work of the Wellbeing Impacts Group. I mentioned before, this is what Carl Thomas from Welsh Government came to share his reflections about, and about how do we change fundamentally what we're measuring. And if we look at measuring Scope 3 emissions across the supply chain, it was compared to almost changing the currency. We're not talking about value for money necessarily, or we're not focusing on the price, we're focusing on the emissions. And that becomes incredibly challenging to take this different approach, but a really important approach, because what we're trying to do is reduce our carbon emissions. And we reflected on the fact that that's everybody's job. It's not just procurement. but everybody needs to be aware of what we're doing to reduce carbon emissions. And I think a really interesting reflection to go away from is that if we're changing the currency to kind of delivering well-being, what does that look like? We reflected around we need to take risks. If we're going to be measuring things differently, it's okay if it fails to begin with, and we can learn from those failings. And they're not mistakes, it's just part of the process. And how can we create these kind of safe spaces for dialogue to move away from being a fear of being criticised? And that to take that approach, we need support from leadership. We need to work collaboratively across public bodies to share our learning and involve stakeholders as we take these different approaches. We considered kind of that annual reporting should help transparency, and looked at the role of organisations like ourselves, like the Commissioner's Office, to call out where perhaps there are missed opportunities, but also to spread the lessons learned and the way that we're working beyond procurement. Maybe there's a discussion there around should that be the Commissioner's job or not. But also looking at how we can demonstrate contribution to the wellbeing goals. This goes back to the point around the quantitative and qualitative measures, that we don't want this to be a tick boxing exercise. We want to tell a story. We want to tell a story of the impact that we're delivering. And again, around the smaller spend, it might be small, but can we deliver impacts in a meaningful way? The last area, and this is where hopefully my colleague Jonathan, who's not here, would have come in and picked up from this discussion, but the role of the private sector and involving suppliers in decisions as well. So some of the thought in the room is that how can we work more effectively with smaller companies with smaller spend to achieve the act? How do we communicate what it is that we're trying to deliver to organisations that might not have the capacity or the resource? So it's really important that any toolkits that are developed and that are designed for SMEs are done so acknowledging their capacity. And how we can overcome some of the barriers where organisations perhaps are not engaging. Also looked at there being a real wish that the community of business would work more effectively together to be able to communicate what works well and where there are opportunities of different scales, as well as a lot of focus on kind of collaboration with and across supply chains. So my hope in that sharing kind of these thoughts in this discussion is not that we've got the answers from this, but that it was really important to take the time to have these discussions, to have this dialogue. And there are always kind of new points that are raised as people are progressing on their journey to putting the act at the core of procurement decision making. I've tried to condense what was a whole day's workshop into a few slides, so I'm sure that there are lots of lessons that I've missed and key points that haven't been captured there. But I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about the work that the Commissioner's Office has been doing to involve business and the importance of involving the private sector, involving businesses in the contribution to that shared vision to our wellbeing goals. Now, I apologise, this is not my area that I normally lead on, but Jonathan has entrusted me to share his work with you today. So the first kind of slide that I want to talk about is why we're having this conversation. Why do we spend time working with businesses? And the main reason is we can't achieve the Wales's wellbeing goals without including businesses as well. And actually a Cenedlaethau'r PAC inquiry back in 2021 found that public bodies are not doing enough, or were not doing enough then, to leverage the capacity of business to achieve their wellbeing plans. And this is going back to the point I made earlier around wellbeing objectives, that as public bodies are setting their wellbeing objectives, they should be really focused on the kind of regional priorities. What is it that the inequalities that they're trying to reduce, for example, that they're really focusing on? And that will differ for the different remits of the public bodies. And how do we involve businesses in those discussions in trying to meet those priorities for the people that we serve. We're also finding in the Commissioner's Office that the public sector is increasingly asking us, how do they work with businesses on contributing to their wellbeing goals? And equally, there's a growing number of businesses asking us what they can do around the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act as well. So it feels like a good place to sit in, where we can provide this kind of consistent support to both the public and private sectors. Jonathan has been doing a big piece of work around kind of reviewing businesses and the wellbeing goals, looking so far at the journey around the kind of impact of Welsh Government initiatives, and looking at where there are opportunities to embed the wellbeing goals across these different levers. Looking at the economic contract, a focus on procurement, where we can take lessons from the work that we've already done in this space and what we know that public bodies are telling us, how we can work with other organisations in this space, for example, Business Wales, that are providing support as well as some of those other existing partnerships that exist, for example, like the corporate joint committees. And also looked at kind of where businesses want to be part of the conversation, where they can contribute towards achieving these goals, and why they're in this space. And it's been, I guess, strength here is that when you've got businesses in the public sector working with this same language, we're seeing better collaboration, better outcomes. And there is already a lot of work that's happening in this space. So Jonathan has been working with a number of larger Welsh companies that are already changing their vocabulary and their approach away from the SGs and mapping that against our wellbeing goals. So he's been working with Principality as an example of that. And business networks want to collaborate. So we're pushing against an open door in this space, that they want to come on the journey with us around implementing the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. I want to share now a couple of the projects that Jonathan and our office has been working on to provide support in this space. So the first one is a kind of toolkit, a guidance tool designed for SMEs to look at the wellbeing goals. The idea is that you can take your organisational priorities and your kind of current areas of focus and map them against our wellbeing goals. Kind of that bridging the gap in the language, I suppose, that we're using here, and really ensuring that the SMEs are working within this Welsh context of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. The first draft of this has been complete, and it's been tweaked and tested and trialled with a number of organisations. I think it's a really good example of kind of bringing together the different language that gets used into kind of one cohesive approach. The hope, and you can see there's a nice picture of it, is that this is going to be published soon. Jonathan's just in conversations at the moment about how we can get this to be published. It currently exists as kind of a spreadsheet, but we want it to be a really simple document to be able to use, an interactive document online. The second project and the second area of focus at the moment is bringing together large companies. And then Jonathan and others in our office have been working at how we can support larger companies align the wellbeing goals to their areas of focus, and working to kind of improve and strengthen the collaboration that is happening between businesses and the public sector. And so that kind of asks the question, well, how can we promote the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and the wellbeing goals to businesses? I'm already seeing loads of stuff in this space. So it might be through regional supplier events. There's an example of Mid and West Wales Fire and Rescue Service who have been doing this, or promoting kind of social enterprises. There's also a role here to focus on the globally responsible wellbeing goal, and looking at the impact that decisions we have and we make in Wales have on the rest of the world. So, for example, at COP26, the Commissioner spoke to Rivelano Vera Gabriel, who's a Brazilian tribal chief, and kind of seeing the impacts of deforestation like on the front line in the Amazon. and he spoke about the impacts that soy farming are having on the Guarani indigenous people, and looked at how soy imports to Wales couldn't just be responsible for deforestation, but the kind of indigenous blood. And that currently an area of about 40% of the size of Wales is used overseas to grow commodities imported into Wales. So this means that deforestation has meant that the ability for people to survive has become increasingly challenging, with kind of rivers becoming polluted, traditional herbs no longer found, and hunting being made more difficult. And I'm sharing this because it's more complicated than us working with businesses to say, let's buy local and eat local. And actually I found an interesting statistic recently that in some cases, apples bought from New Zealand to the UK can have a lower emissions than apples grown here locally and transported around the UK. And these examples really highlight that what we eat has changed the planet, that food production is not only the greatest driver of wildlife loss, it contributes to the climate crisis. And about a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions are associated with food. I'm sharing these examples because it illustrates how we kind of need to think bigger, we need to think in innovative ways, look at how we can inspire new ways of thinking and how we can change mindsets. It's really important that we're having this conversation, not just within the public sector, but engaging with businesses as well. That's the end of my slideshow, so I'll stop sharing my screen. My mouse has decided to freeze, so apologies, it's just taking a second. While I do this, I'll pause for any questions.
Thank you so much, Alice, and I appreciate you coming in and sharing both perspectives of yourself and Jonathan. So wearing two hats today, thank you for doing that, because I think it gave us an incredibly rich picture of the event, which has been sparking little light bulbs in my head as you've been talking, and certainly from us as the key development team, your early engagement with this alpha and continued willingness to come participate in our user testing sessions, give us challenge, constructive feedback, and broaden our thinking with that first way of working that you mentioned all the way through collaboration has been incredibly valuable. So from the key team to your office, thank you for being willing to come with us on the journey. And today was a great example of the touch points, right, between procurement, commercial life cycle, and future generations. So that's the thank you from us to you. I'll pause now and see if we have any questions. We don't have anything in the Q&A, but that doesn't mean that people's brains aren't being stimulated by what they've heard. So I will pause there. I'll open the floor, and any discussion or questions, then please feel free to jump in.
If I may, Corey, I'd just like to echo the gratitude and also to offer some reflections, and then I think that will lead into some questions that I have. But I think, well, firstly, congratulations on distilling a whole day into 35 minutes or so. That's a challenge in itself. I think there were several things that really chimed with not only the work that we're doing with Keed, but my personal experiences as a commercial and procurement practitioner for my whole professional life, is around there seems to me to be an absolute beautiful alignment between everything that the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales seeks to do and achieve with the approach of Keed, and particularly around like the involvement point, user-centered design, community engagement, and also the iterative and incremental approach to trying things differently. I think there's a bunch of things that are kind of tied up in that, in terms of skills, willingness to work in different ways, and the confidence and the competence to do that, which I think we're focusing on now with the Welsh Government team that's looking at kind of skills and capabilities. So Yeah, I just wonder if you touched on this, but what do you see to be the roles of other areas within the public sector, particularly where perhaps there could be greater collaboration between the procurement and commercial practitioners with other functional areas within those organisations?
Yeah, I feel like that's a lot of questions all in one, Warren. But firstly, just thank you for your appreciation. Like, I'm more than happy to come and be involved, and it's great to have these discussions. So I guess one of the first areas that I feel like I have to kind of share or flag is it's great that there is this kind of alignment around the work of CEED and the work of the Commissioner's Office. I suppose personally it's really positive because one of the recommendations when the Commissioner's Office conducted their first ever Section 20 review was that there needed to be a centre of excellence, that there needed to be a core space where we can improve skills, work differently, share practice, involve and collaborate. So I think this kind of space was one that the Commissioner had recommended and called for. I think that when it comes to seeing kind of the different roles and the different functions and where that works together, procurement is outlined as one of 7 corporate areas of change. So these are the 7 areas that are common across all of the public bodies listed in the Act. And these are the areas where, to be able to see the real change that we need, the kind of in sometimes challenging systemic change, they're the key areas where we can see the difference. So I think it's really important, as we're seeing, both in kind of a legislative space with the Social Partnership and Public Procurement Act, as well as the Wellbeing Future Generations Act, but also from a kind of an operations perspective where we're seeing people making real progress and starting to take steps around kind of being bold and being brave and being innovative. It's important that we share those lessons with, I think, some of the other functions, not just, I suppose, this sharing with networks of other procurement commercial practitioners, but across looking at planning and assets, and many of those are joined up as well. So I think that that's a good starting point. I always refer back to the legislation, that if procurement is one of these key areas, well, where are the other key areas? And how can we be broadening that dialogue as well? I think the other thing is maybe around being honest with, this is where the challenges and the barriers are, and this is where they've overcome. And it's been a long journey to get to this point of where we're seeing great practice. But equally, a lot of this is stuff that's maybe been happening for a long time that we're building upon. So maybe a bit of a waffly long answer there, Warren, but I think there is a role for procurement professionals to reach out to other areas, but there's also other areas of public bodies to be part of this conversation as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that wasn't at all a waffly response to my kind of like mega question, I suppose, or the way that I presented it. I think, yeah, and that's for me is really, really important and really interesting. And I think a lot of we talk about procurement here, but actually a lot of the decisions are being made, both good and potentially not so good, upstream of the procurement, the formal procurement process. So you mentioned planning, but I think also in like the whole kind of setting of budgets and the allocation of budgets to departments. So I think, yeah, absolutely, the role of like finance, planners, but fundamentally how important it is for civic engagement, as well as engagement with other sectors who absolutely, as you say, have a role to play here, private, social, charitable sectors as well, all mobilise to achieve that common set of purpose and objectives as defined by the legislation. So I think that's really key. Do you think there needs to be some other change within organisations in order to create those enabling environments for different things to be tried and you have mentioned this, and so like, you know, not for there to be kind of finger pointing towards, oh well, that didn't work, you said you're going to do this but this actually happened, kind of reimagining failure in order to support more innovative approaches.
I think it's a really difficult one, because I could imagine if I were listening to this discussion in a local authority where my budget is being reduced, and I would say, we can't reimagine failure, we need to just do our statutory core services. So I think it's really important that we are, I suppose, empathetic to this situation. Like, I'm not in a local authority where my budget for this has just been cut. The budget crisis, the situation is challenging across the board. However, saying that, the Act, given kind of this current time, it is an opportunity for us to reimagine how we work. And there are examples around that actually, by putting the Act at the centre, maybe we can think long term and look at how can we reduce spending in the longer term. And that does require us to reimagine failure, and that does require us to change things to create enabling environments. Recently, I was at the Centre for Alternative Technology, and they were sharing with us kind of some of their key lessons and their kind of key enablers to change. And a lot of what we talk about in this space is around policy and legislation and processes and practices. But what they were sharing with us was actually those things are all important, but those things are not necessarily always the ones that are going to deliver this big change. The big change comes from when we have mindset and culture change. We often refer to it as like hearts and minds. And that stuff, the less tangible change, is really difficult, and that does require us to behave differently, to create enabling environments. And I think it's through that mindset shift that those enabling environments can be created, not always just, you know, the Act gives people permission to do things differently, and that's something that I hear a lot, that I can be bold and brave because it's written in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, but that change requires people to use that Act and to do things differently. So I do think it is needed. I think I would, you know, I think there is a lot happening. There are great networks and great spaces and people working within challenging constraints to deliver great stuff. It's just, how do we share that, and how do we scale it up, and how do we, you know, provide support to people who are already on their journey in this space, I suppose.
Well, that's almost, if not actually, a beautiful segue into the purpose of KEED, right? We're there to help set up to provide that support, to provide that kind of the tooling, to show the way, to create the safe space where people can talk about the challenges and can share experiences of what has worked and what hasn't worked. So I think that kind of leads me on to possibly my last, or at least penultimate question, which is, what more do you think we could be doing as KEED in closer collaboration with yourselves to support better achieving the objectives of the Future Generations Commissioner's Office?
That's a big question. I might need to, it doesn't help for this discussion today, but I might need to go away and reflect upon that one and come back. But I suppose ensuring that we're regularly communicating is always going to be a good first port of call. We, as an office, actually, we've got an organisational collective called the Supporting Organisations Network. So this is a space where in some cases they're public bodies, but broadly they are organisations that are helping to support the implementation of the Act. And that's a space where we're seeing more collaboration and more join up. It's great for us to be able to share as an office. This is what we're working on. Where could you feed in? Or equally, what are you working on? How can we feed into that? You know, the Commissioner's Office, we don't have all the answers. I can be an expert on the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, but I can't be an expert on anything else. And sometimes I struggle with that. But I think it's bringing other experts into that broader conversation. So I guess that would be my first suggestion, is for us to continue communicating and continue talking, and sharing the lessons that we're learning, as well as, I suppose, the lessons that you're learning. The Commissioner's Office is in a kind of a time of flux at the moment, because the new Commissioner, Derek, has been in post for about 7 months now, and we're at a point as an office where we're going to be sharing our kind of what the next phase of the Commissioner's Office is going to look like, our priorities for the next sort of 7 years and beyond. And the hope there is that we are being kind of really clear with the areas that we're focusing on, that will make it, I suppose, simpler, make it easier for organisations like yourselves to be able to feed into that work as well.
Brilliant. I just wanted to see if also, Corey, if you have any questions or reflections. No is fine, but it's because of other, just see, because there's obviously we talk a lot between ourselves as at the opportunities that exist at the intersection between user-centered design, agile delivery, and procurement and commercial, and so that's kind of like, you know, me and Corey in a nutshell there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really timely to have this discussion as we are thinking about the future of Cyd itself. And again, you know, I would really welcome that opportunity to keep talking, because we are obviously thinking about it in terms of our timescales as we work in this agile way. So it's a really interesting dynamic where we purposely work in iterative 2-week sprints, but yet everything that we do is building to having a sustainable service offering that lasts way beyond all of us, probably, you know, well into the future. So I think that way of working is absolutely critical, and that really is my reflection of all of this, is bringing that together and continuing to do so. So yeah, for me, that is a perfect time to do it.
Yeah, I have to say, Corey, that sounds very tiring. A lot of two-week sprints. I'm not sure I could work in like that.
It's an interesting one because it allows you to do exactly what you've outlined, which is to take the principles of, you know, the future principles, but adapt them. And so you don't end up veering off on a path that you cannot then pivot away from when you discover something new. So it has the future built in, even though it's short chunks of work. So yeah.
Oh, I'd like to hear more about that way of working. That sounds cool. Yeah, and I'm just to flag, I suppose, and if anybody else wants to come in, that's fine. But if there are other topics people are interested in, you know, the way that we're working as an office now, we have I showed it at the beginning, that slide around our public body PSB regional leads. They are kind of like the key contacts, so I can share those, and it is available on our website as well. But if you've got specific things that you're looking for a bit of support on, or if you want to show some of the great stuff you're doing, then get in touch with those people, or we've got email address to contact us at futuregenerationscommissioner.wales. But equally, on our website, we've got a page around providing advice and support. And on there, it's got a list of all of the other workshops that are coming up as well. And these only get put on because people ask for them, because they're requested, because we get kind of feedback as how we can shape the way that we work. So yeah, they're available on the website. We've got some coming up around long-term thinking. I think there's another one around kind of providing a refresher of the Act. And equally, we had the one around procurement that was advertised on there as well. So yeah, keep your eyes out for things coming up. We're always putting on new events, and let us know if there are specific areas you'd like to focus on in the future.
Perfect. And speaking of events, it's probably a good way to start to wrap up this session. I know otherwise we'd be here with you all afternoon, Alice, because we could delve into this for a long time. But speaking of the next event, so Cydrannu, our next event will be coming up live from ProcureX, which is on November the 8th. So a slightly different flavour for that. But we will be releasing a bit more information about that soon, so you can keep an eye on the website and you'll find out what to expect from the key team from that session. I think I will wrap up this afternoon's session there. Thank you again so much, Alice, for joining us. Thank you, Warren, again for leading that discussion, and looking forward to seeing some of you live at ProcureX next month.